You really need to buy a new SSD. There's another secret PS5 upgrade. And is Sony trying to force you to buy a PS5 Pro? How's it going, everyone? Welcome to PSReady. This is the weekly news show, and today we are talking about discs once again, because even though next year we're supposedly getting a revamped PlayStation 5 that comes as a digital model and it also includes a detachable disc drive, or you're going to be able to pay like $450 or something to get just the digital version of the console, it looks like discs might be becoming a thing of the past sooner than we thought. First, there was the story last week that EA is taking discs away from any German-speaking country in Europe. They're saying, yep, you guys just gotta download the games now because no one's really buying physical games anymore. Of course, you can't even get physical PC games anymore, which is crazy. And now we've got games like Call of Duty coming out where the disc is literally just a 70 megabyte license checker file, and then you've got to download over 150 gigabytes of game data. Now, this is making people mad for a few reasons. First of all, of course, the campaign and the beta were both really small at around 14 gigabytes. So to see that balloon all the way up to 150 gigabytes on release is really irritating for people, especially if they took off work to play this game the first day it's released, right? Like, you've got to download a huge patch, and who's to say that there's not going to be more patches throughout the weekend as they add more servers when they realize how many people are playing this game. And then there's also the fact that this is going to get seasons, Warzone 2 in the DMZ mode, and some actual raids like Destiny style raids added to the game. And when those get added, they're going to balloon the game up even more. So now you need 150 gigabytes of storage, but in a month when season 1 starts, you're going to need even more storage for this game. And when you consider how big games like The Last of Us Part 1 are, or Returnal, or Demon's Souls, or Deathloop, or any of these games you can just download for free off of the PlayStation Extra library, a lot of people are just kind of fed up. They're throwing their hands up in the air and saying, fine, Sony, you don't want to give me more than 680 usable gigabytes of storage. I just got to go out and buy an SSD. The silver lining for us PlayStation fans is obviously that we have the option to just go get an SSD and pop it in our PlayStation 5. It's a relatively easy process. And on the Xbox Series X and S, you have that convenient option as well. It's the SanDisk little chip that you pop in the back, and that's directly connecting to the motherboard, which means you're getting the exact same speeds out of it, whereas with the PlayStation 5, you're getting variable speeds across the board. But still, that thing is extremely expensive. Like, you're going to be paying upwards of $250 for just a terabyte, whereas with the PlayStation 5, the SSDs you're going to buy for it are $250 for 2 terabytes. This is a little conflicting for me because I play on both PC and PS5, and on PC, I've had to deal with storage issues for years now. Basically, the last decade, I've had to download every game to my actual PC, which games on PC are the same size as they are on the PlayStation 4 and 5. So I had to like delete a bunch of stuff to be able to download big games. And then on the PlayStation 4, it was even more irritating because you'd have to have double the actual space needed to install updates or install the games, because the PS4 had to copy the game to the hard drive, and then it would open the game up and copy the exact same size file onto the hard drive again so that you could actually play it. And some games on the PlayStation 5 still do that. So thankfully, it looks like with Call of Duty, if you're downloading the PS5 version, it doesn't have to do the copying stage, which would really suck because you need 300 gigabytes free on your SSD, which is about half of what's actually usable. So thankfully, that's not the case. But yeah, if you haven't invested in an SSD, I have them all linked down in the description. You should definitely pick one up. Next up, if you were planning on playing the Calisto protocol on PlayStation 5, you're going to be really disappointed when you hear that it was canceled in Japan. So usually you hear about stuff like this happening in Australia because they have super strict rules with rated M games. Wolfenstein 2 took a really long time to come out there because a lot of the World War II bad guy imagery that was in that game, and of course Hotline Miami, I don't think ever came out in Australia just because of how gory and bloody that game is. But in Japan, their Sero ratings board basically told Striking Distance Studios that if they want to release the Callisto protocol in Japan, they have to tone down the graphic violence in the game quite a bit. And they're just throwing their hands up and saying, well, sorry, Japan, you're not going to end up playing the Calisto protocol. And there's obviously a few reasons for that. First of all, the gaming market in Japan isn't exactly the biggest in the world. And I'm sure they also looked at the fact that this game probably wasn't going to resonate with that audience that much, just because you can look at games like Dead Space or Resident Evil and see how much they sell there and say, well, we're only looking at this many copies if we go through the effort of altering the game. And it's not really worth the time, money, or effort to do it because we're only supporting just a few people over there on the PlayStation 5. Also, the most popular system lately in Japan is the Nintendo Switch. I mean, if you look at Splatoon 3, is something like 3% of the entire island of Japan bought Splatoon 3 on release, and they were playing the hell out of that game. Whereas something like the Calisto protocol, which isn't even releasing on the Nintendo Switch, I don't think it would have sold that well to begin with in Japan. So you can kind of see why they're saying, yeah, screw it, we're just not going to release in Japan. Thankfully though, the region-free console trend that started with Sony and the PlayStation Vita is also holding true with the PlayStation 5. So if you are in Japan and you want to play the Calisto protocol, you have multiple options. You could import the game's disc from another country, and I'm sure it will have like localized Japanese audio, I would guess, because this is happening like right before the game released. So I'd assume that that Japanese audio is already recorded for the game. You could also make a United States PlayStation Network account and then just buy a gift card from Amazon or something like that, add the money to your account, and then download the game that way. I know people do that in reverse. Like people like to play games early by making an Australian Nintendo Switch account, and then they go on like Play Asia or a different Amazon site and they buy a Nintendo Switch eShop gift card for that currency, and then you can buy the game early because, you know, Australia is like 24 hours ahead or whatever. So unlike the ballooning game storage sizes, I don't really think there's that much to worry about here with the Calisto protocol. It's just frustrating that this ratings board waited until like a month before the game comes out to really cause these problems for them. Because even though it's a small market buying the game over in Japan, that's still a number of sales that they're not going to get now because they can't release the game without altering it. But as a huge horror fan who loves gore and blood and violence in movies and games, I'm glad that they're putting their foot down and saying, no, we're not going to tone down the violence. This is an M-rated game. Like, you're going to get some crazy violence no matter how you play it. We're not toning it down. So you guys might remember a few months back when we talked about how a lot of the apps you use on your PlayStation 5 are actually just PS4 apps being run on your PlayStation 5 in backwards compatibility. The last time we talked about this was with Disney Plus, which was secretly updated in the background to be a native PS5 app, and the benefit that came along with that was improved audio quality and you could stream in 4K. And also, when you take into consideration that even though you do get these apps, even though they're PlayStation 4 apps, you can still use them on the PlayStation 5, they don't really have as many apps as the Xbox Series X, which is super frustrating because my favorite accessory for the PlayStation 5 is that media remote, because it has a YouTube button, it has a Netflix button, it has a Hulu button, and then I use those apps on the PlayStation 5, but then when I want to watch Shudder or Screenbox TV, I gotta switch over to the Xbox. It's super frustrating. But we're slowly and surely getting a lot of these PS4 apps updated to PS5 versions, the latest one being Spotify. So now, if you go try to use the Spotify app that was already installed on your PlayStation 5, you're gonna be met with an error message that says this app is no longer supported. But if you see that, do not panic. It just means you need to go to the PlayStation Store and find Spotify for PS5, because now there's a brand new native PS5 app, and what I'm assuming it does is just make sure that it's like using the full resolution features of the PS5, or maybe improving the audio streaming quality just a little bit, or Spotify just realized that the PlayStation 5 is out and they want to make sure you can actually stream your music to an actual native app. It's kind of interesting to me though, because the PlayStation 5 has Spotify and Apple Music streaming built into its control center. So if you hit the PS button, it brings up the control center and there's a little charm for a music note. And if you click that, you can pick between Apple Music or Spotify and play your music over your games, which is a great feature. I just used it with Fortnite because I had to boot that up to buy the Ash Williams skin. And while I was playing with my friend, I realized I wanted to hear some Spirit Box. So I pulled up my Apple Music app, played it through there, and it worked absolutely fantastically. Like, they even give you granular volume switching. So you can control the chat, you can control the in-game audio, and you can control the music, which is absolutely phenomenal. So there's a huge controversy in the world of video games right now thanks to two games, A Plague Tale Requiem and Gotham Knights. The big issue is both of these games run at 30 frames per second, and specifically, they do not have performance modes on the PlayStation 5. The big issue stems from the fact that both Gotham Knights and A Plague Tale Requiem are both next-gen only games, and they both released without any performance modes. It's not entirely true with A Plague Tale Requiem, because if you do have a 120 Hz monitor or a TV that supports 120 Hz, you can actually play the game at 40 FPS, and if you play the game at that frame rate, it looks so much better than 30 FPS. 40 FPS looks like it's a lot closer to 60 FPS than it does 30 FPS, even though it's actually the direct halfway point between those two frame rates. And the reason for that is frame time. So if you're playing a game at 60 FPS, you're seeing a new frame every 16.6 milliseconds, but if you go down to 30, it doubles that effectively. So you're seeing a new frame every 33.3 milliseconds. But if you're playing at at 40 FPS on a 120 hertz monitor, you are going to see a new frame every 25 on the dot milliseconds, which looks great. It's how I play every game on the Steam Deck now, and I love it. Gotham Knights, on the other hand, is just an unfinished mess. This game had a PS4 and Xbox One version in development, which they ended up canceling, and people were like, oh, is it because this game is going to graphically look really good and be an exciting open world experience that's a ton of fun to play? The answer to that question turned out to be no. I put around 6 or 7 hours into this game over the last weekend, and what it turned out to be is that they just decided not to optimize this game, and even though the PS5 has a great GPU on its APU chip, it's not taking advantage of the CPU in any way. It has terrible single core performance, and the interesting thing is Digital Foundry took a CPU that's very similar to the CPU in the PS5 and put it on a PC version of the game, and Gotham Knights actually has slowdown to below 30 FPS in the exact same spots on both PC and PS5 because it's related to streaming, so it doesn't really pull in new data fast enough and you see a stutter, which is super irritating and unacceptable. So the frustrating thing here is that places like Digital Foundry and other developers are pointing this out, but the only reason it turns out we've been having so many 60 FPS games on the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X is because they're all cross-gen games, and these are super powerful consoles, so you're basically taking a PS4 game and using the extra headroom that the PS5 has available to run that game at 60 frames per second. And we've seen it on stuff like God of War, we've seen it on stuff like Ghost of Tsushima, and pretty much every cross-generation game that gets a PS5 patch, the easy answer is to make it run at 60 FPS. But now that we're moving on from that cross-generational period where we're seeing games release on PS4 and PS5, the games are taking more advantage of the PlayStation 5, and because of that, the highest headroom you really get is being able to play the game at 40 FPS on 120 hertz TV. Sony just sent out the dev kits for the PlayStation 5 Pro. That thing is looming on the horizon, and I guarantee you that the biggest selling point of that console is going to be 60 frames per second PS5 games. So when we start seeing stuff like Spider-Man 2, when we start seeing stuff like Wolverine, or whatever Naughty Dog is working on with the new studio that opened up, this new multiplayer open world game in the Last of Us universe, all of those games I'm willing to bet will be 30 FPS max on the PlayStation 5 base model and the PS5 Slim, and then when you move up to the PS5 Pro, you're going to get pretty much the exact same looking game, but you're going to be able to play it at 60 FPS. This is obviously a corner that both Microsoft and Sony have painted themselves into by allowing games to keep coming out on old gen consoles for this long. They're basically saying, yeah, you can release your old gen console game on the PlayStation 5, just make sure it runs at 60 FPS. So they set a new standard that people have gotten extremely used to over the past 2 years, and now they're basically turning around and saying, yep, now that we're going to sunset the PlayStation 4 and these last gen games on consoles, you're going to start seeing 30 FPS games again. And really, at that point, your only two options are going to be buy a PlayStation 5 Pro or build a gaming PC, just like you had in the PS3 and the PS4 generations. Now, I have had a PC for a long time. I'm very used to 60 FPS. I really liked having PlayStation games that were at 60 frames per second, and that's what's really going to end up selling me on the PlayStation 5 Pro, being able to play games at 60 FPS, because once you go to that frame rate, it is extremely, extremely hard to drop back down to 30. You can actually start to see the individual frames that are being doubled up by VSync when you're spinning the camera around, and it's like, once you see it, you really can't unsee it. I'm less worried about it with games like A Plague Tale Requiem, because if you look at that game, it looks like a next-gen game, it looks like it's pushing the console to its limit, and the 30 FPS is pretty consistent. Whereas Gotham Knights looks worse than Arkham Knight, which came out in 2015, over 7 years ago, and that game has even frame pacing. But even on Gotham Knights on the PlayStation 5, if you spin the camera around, the frame pacing is all jacked up, so you start to see stuttering, which is just super unfortunate and super frustrating. So it's just unfortunate timing, I think. I don't think we're going to see every game hit 30 FPS going forward. I think we're still going to see some games that hit 60. But the moral of the story here is you should definitely pick up A Plague Tale Requiem for full price, and you should wait till Gotham Knights is free on PlayStation Plus, because even if they fix it, I think it's pretty unacceptable that they released it in the state that they did.